I had been in this house for decades. Every corner, every chair, every vase on the shelf carried memories of a life built carefully, deliberately, with love. I had watched Saad grow from a boy who clung to my hand into a man whose presence once revolved around our home. And I had married him to a life I thought would expand our family, not diminish my place in it. But now the familiar felt strange. It started subtly, almost imperceptibly. Small changes in behavior, almost harmless, yet enough to shift the air around me. Saad no longer asked for my opinion before making small decisions. Sana would laugh at something they shared and forget I was even there. Conversations that once included me naturally had narrowed, becoming a private world that I was only allowed to witness. The first time I noticed it clearly, we were having dinner. The table was set, food steaming from the kitchen. Saad and Sana were talking about a weekend plan. I leaned forward to add a suggestion, a simple thought on timing or logistics, nothing more, and I realized they had already decided everything without me. "Let's just leave early Saturday," Saad said, smiling at Sana, not looking at me. I paused, mouth half open, words ready to spill. But they didn't belong there. Not anymore. So I simply nodded. "Yes, sounds fine," I said. And just like that, I felt the shift. Not dramatic, not loud, but definite. My voice no longer mattered in moments that used to require me. I was still physically present, yes. I still poured the drinks, passed the plates, smiled at the right moments. But the subtle thread that once tied me to their decisions, the unspoken respect, the natural reliance, had loosened. I tried to ignore it at first, chalking it up to adjustment. Every couple has private moments. Every marriage reshapes the family dynamic. Perhaps I was being overly sensitive. Perhaps it was just a temporary phase. But the feeling persisted. Later that evening, I sat in the living room while they went to discuss something in the kitchen. Their voices were low, muted by the distance, but laughter laced through it. I could sense a plan being made, a plan in which I would not participate, a plan I would only observe. I felt a familiar pang, the ache of invisibility. I realized, with a clarity that startled me, that I was no longer central. I had not been pushed out aggressively or cruelly. No words had been spoken, no lines drawn. But my role had quietly changed, reshaped by their intimacy and my restraint. I was still a mother, still part of this home. But my presence no longer carried the same weight. I found myself moving carefully through the house. I set down cups softly. I arranged the cushions just so. I smiled when Saad and Sana shared jokes, careful not to interrupt. It was as if I had become part of the furniture. There, familiar, useful, but ultimately unnoticed. I tried to tell myself that this was natural, that this was the evolution of family life. But late at night, when the house fell silent and I sat alone by the window, the truth became undeniable. I was invisible. Sitting right beside my own family, I was invisible. It wasn't just the small things, the conversations, the plans, the laughter. It was the absence of recognition, the lack of acknowledgement that I existed as a person with thoughts, feelings, and desires. I had loved them fiercely, invested every ounce of care into their lives, and now I felt peripheral. My heart ached quietly, without protest. One afternoon, I tried to participate in a discussion about the family budget. I suggested a small change, something simple, something practical. Saad nodded politely, then returned to Sana, discussing options in hushed tones. My suggestion was acknowledged, then gently set aside. I smiled. I thanked them for considering it. But inside, a quiet grief grew. A grief without words. It was the kind of sadness that doesn't demand acknowledgement. It simply sits with you, shaping your perception of the space you occupy. I found myself avoiding initiating conversation. Why risk being ignored again? Why attempt to be part of decisions that had outgrown me? So I retreated inward, observing more, speaking less, learning the delicate art of being present without being needed. The strangest part was how natural it became. Over weeks, I learned to anticipate my invisibility. I would enter a room and watch, smile at the right moments, laugh when appropriate, all while keeping my thoughts carefully to myself. I had mastered the art of invisibility, a skill I had never intended to learn. And yet, even as I perfected it, the ache persisted. Sitting in the living room, passing the plates, listening to their quiet exchanges, I realized the profound truth. I had never imagined that love could coexist with absence, that one could care deeply and yet be almost entirely unseen by the ones they love most. I remembered a photograph on the wall, Saad as a boy, grinning from ear to ear, arms wrapped around me in unguarded affection. How easily he had once relied on me for guidance, comfort, and laughter. And now, that boy had grown into a man who barely noticed the quiet ache of the woman who had always been beside him. I sighed softly, letting the feeling wash over me. There was no anger, no accusation, only recognition. The home I had built, the family I had nurtured, the love I had given unconditionally, it remained. But its shape had changed. I was still part of it, yes, but in a different way. And so, I sat there, watching them, smiling at the right moments, hiding the hurt behind quiet dignity, learning a new role, being present, yet invisible. It was a role I had not chosen, but it was one I would inhabit gracefully because that is what love demands, even when it is unacknowledged. The days had begun to blend into one another, each one marked not by drama, but by the quiet, almost imperceptible absence of recognition. It was like living underwater, everything familiar, but muted, distant, and slightly unreachable. I moved through the house like a ghost, my presence assumed, my voice secondary, my opinions quietly catalogued and often ignored. It started with tiny details. Saad would reorganize a corner of the living room and only casually mention it to Sanaa. She would laugh in appreciation and pat him on the shoulder, but not glance my way. I would see the change, note it silently, and continue as if it were ordinary. I tried to remind myself. Perhaps they didn't realize. Perhaps I was reading too much into the subtleties of their behavior. I loved them, and love often requires patience. But love also requires acknowledgement, and that was something I wasn't receiving. One morning, I joined them at the breakfast table, tray in hand, carrying the coffee and toast as I had done for years. Saad was discussing his work with Sanaa, animated and smiling. I attempted to offer a small anecdote, a story of something that happened during my walk that morning, something light, meant to elicit a laugh, a shared glance. "Mom, can you pass the syrup?" Saad said distractedly. I froze for a heartbeat. My words hung in the air unnoticed as he reached past me for the bottle. Sanaa chuckled at the comment Saad made next, still oblivious to my presence. I set the tray down carefully, smiled faintly, and withdrew into silence. I felt a familiar ache tighten around my chest. Sitting right there, beside my own family, I was invisible. Later that day, I found myself cleaning the kitchen while they spoke in the living room. I could hear their laughter, low and intimate, words exchanged that didn't require me to understand, much less participate. A thought came unbidden. Perhaps this is how life was meant to be for them. Perhaps they had created a world that excluded me, not intentionally, but naturally. Even so, the feeling stung. I had nurtured Saad, raised him, guided him, and now I existed only as background, a silent observer of a family that had grown beyond me. As I sat in the living room that afternoon, I noticed something else, small, seemingly insignificant gestures that once would have included me. Saad and Sanaa would exchange inside jokes over television, leaning into each other, smiling, but never inviting me in. They would make plans for the weekend, without consulting me. Even small household decisions, where to place a chair, which movie to watch, were made without a glance in my direction. It was as though I had become furniture, useful, expected, present, but ultimately invisible. And yet, I did not speak. I had learned that silence carried its own power. I could observe, understand, and even influence subtly, without needing recognition. It was a skill I honed, quietly, day by day, until it became second nature. I moved carefully, spoke softly, and smiled when appropriate. One evening, while folding laundry, I overheard them planning a small weekend trip. My heart lifted briefly at the thought of spending time with them, but then sank when I realized they had already made all the arrangements. I wasn't asked for advice, invited to help, or even informed until the last moment. I carried the basket upstairs, feeling the weight not just of clothes, but of my own unspoken sadness. Later, Saad came to me, concerned about something trivial. I offered advice, which he listened to politely. But then he went back to Sanaa, discussing the next steps without me. I nodded, smiled, and excused myself. My advice mattered less than their shared decisions. I realized painfully that I had to accept being an outsider in the life I had built. Even the small gestures of love became bittersweet. I would make a favorite dessert, and they would thank me warmly, yet the gratitude did not feel like acknowledgement. It was ritual, not recognition. I loved them deeply, but the joy of giving had changed shape. It was quieter, subdued, and tinged with the ache of invisibility. I began noticing other subtle signs. Sanaa would move around the house without consulting me, adjusting furniture, hanging pictures, or planning events. Saad, absorbed in his own routines, no longer paused to ask my thoughts. I existed in the space, but I had lost my role as an integral part of it. One night, I sat in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. Saad as a boy, grinning at the camera, birthdays celebrated with friends and relatives, quiet evenings of shared stories. Memories flooded me, and I realized how much had changed. I had once been at the center of it all, the hub of their lives. Now, I was peripheral, a presence acknowledged only when convenient. Tears stung my eyes, though I did not cry. I had learned to mask the hurt, to smile when appropriate, to maintain dignity even as I felt invisible. It was a delicate balance, one I had mastered over months of quiet observation. The truth was undeniable. I was still here. I loved them, cared for them, and nurtured them. Yet sitting beside my own family, I felt invisible, and that realization carried a weight that words could not fully capture. I poured myself a cup of tea and walked to the window, watching the light fade across the garden. The evening air was still, filled with the distant sounds of neighbors and traffic. I thought about the life I had led, the family I had raised, and the love that remained unspoken yet enduring. Nothing had been said to acknowledge the shift. No conversation marked the change in my place within the household. Yet everything had changed. I had to navigate this new reality carefully, learning the art of being present without being seen, caring without being acknowledged, and loving without expecting reciprocity. It was a quiet kind of grief, one that would shape the weeks and months to come. And even as I accepted it, a flicker of hope remained. Perhaps, in time, I could find a way to reclaim not control, but connection, finding moments where I mattered, not by demand, but by the quiet strength of presence. The mornings were the hardest. It wasn't the waking or the routine, it was the quiet realization that even in the most ordinary moments, my presence felt optional. I would pour the coffee, arrange the toast, and sit down with them, smiling as I always had, yet noticing how little my words mattered. It was during these mornings that I began to notice the patterns. Saad would glance at his phone while I spoke, responding only when he was ready to redirect the conversation towards something that interested him. Sanaa, radiant and cheerful, would share anecdotes from her day, but only with Saad. Her laughter would fill the room, but I would feel like a spectator, listening without participating. I smiled anyway. I had learned early on that a smile could disguise everything: hurt, longing, fear. The world rarely paused to consider the emotions hidden behind a simple expression. I had perfected this skill, honed it over years of observing my son and daughter-in-law navigating a life I once thought included me fully. At first, it was disorienting. I would start to speak, only to realize that my words were unnecessary. I had thought that years of raising a son, of nurturing a home, of guiding a family, would guarantee me a place at the table of their decisions. But life had its own plans. Saad and Sana were carving their shared path, and my voice had begun to echo faintly, like a memory of itself. One afternoon, I attempted to join a discussion about the weekend. They were planning a small trip, something I would have once helped organize with enthusiasm. I suggested an alternative route, thinking it might be faster or more scenic. Saad nodded politely, then turned to Sana, their conversation flowing seamlessly without me. I smiled, masking the ache, and returned to my tasks. The words I had meant to share dissolved into silence. My presence had become ceremonial, appreciated in the abstract, but irrelevant in the moment. As the days went on, I began to anticipate this invisibility. I no longer attempted to assert myself. I no longer offered unsolicited advice or corrections. I learned to move quietly, speak softly, and allow the life around me to continue without interruption. It was a form of self-preservation. I was still here, but only in the ways that were permitted, acknowledged, and convenient. And yet, the emotional weight of invisibility persisted. It was subtle, like a shadow stretching across the room, unnoticed by those who inhabited the light. I found myself retreating into observation, watching my son and daughter-in-law interact, memorizing gestures, noting the flow of their shared world. I loved them fiercely, but I was aware of the distance that had grown, the separation that words had not bridged. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the living room, I watched them laughing over a shared joke. I could feel the rhythm of their lives moving around me. I reached for a cushion, adjusted it slightly, smiled at the right moment. But the warmth, the laughter, the intimacy, it all belonged to them, not to me. I felt a quiet ache, the kind that lodges itself behind the ribs, persistent yet unspoken. I had never anticipated that love could feel so simultaneously profound and isolating. I was present, yet peripheral. I was involved, yet excluded. I loved, yet I was unseen. It was during these moments that I discovered the power and danger of restraint. To speak could draw attention, yes, but it could also disrupt the fragile balance that allowed me to witness their lives without conflict. To remain silent was safer, but the cost was my own invisibility. I began to notice how easily invisibility can become a habit. I stopped initiating conversation. I stopped offering input. I let them carve their shared world without interruption. I perfected the art of smiling while feeling hollow, nodding while my heart ached, moving through the motions without expectation. Yet even as I embraced this quiet, I began to recognize a new awareness. I was not powerless. I could choose how to inhabit the spaces around them. I could be present without being consumed. I could love without being acknowledged, and yet preserve the dignity of my own heart. One afternoon, while sitting by the window and watching the neighborhood children play, I reflected on the years of motherhood. Raising Saad had been an act of devotion unlike any other. Watching him grow, teaching him, guiding him, these were responsibilities I had undertaken willingly. And yet, no amount of devotion guaranteed recognition in the life he built as a man with his own partner. Sana, too, had become a world unto herself. I had welcomed her with open arms, offered guidance and warmth, and yet, in their shared intimacy, my role had quietly diminished. I had to accept that love was not always about visibility. Sometimes, it was about witnessing quietly, supporting unobtrusively, and loving without expectation. That evening, as the house grew still, I found solace in small rituals. Pouring tea, arranging flowers, tidying the living room. These acts grounded me. They reminded me that my life was not solely defined by recognition or acknowledgement. I was present, and my presence mattered, even if unobserved. And yet, I longed for acknowledgement. A smile, a nod, a glance that said, "We see you. We notice you. You belong here." I knew that these moments were not guaranteed, but the desire persisted. It was human, natural, and quietly aching in the spaces between their laughter and their conversations. I realized that invisibility was not always a punishment. Sometimes it was a signal. a reminder to find strength, resilience, and identity beyond the roles we are assigned. I began to understand that my love, patience, and dignity had the power to shape my own life, even when unrecognized. Sitting there, watching them, I felt a profound mixture of love and isolation. I was invisible in the moments that mattered, yet I remained a constant presence. And in that tension, I discovered a quiet, fragile truth. One can be both deeply involved and quietly unseen, and still retain the integrity of the heart. It happens slowly, almost imperceptibly, like water wearing down stone. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the small laughs, the whispered exchanges, the private glances. But day after day, week after week, the pattern became undeniable. Saad and Sanaa were no longer just husband and wife. They were a world unto themselves. And I was not part of that world. I tried not to notice at first. Perhaps this was what married life was meant to be, the couple forming their own rhythm, carving out their private spaces while the rest of us, parents, friends, extended family, watched from the edges. And yet, even if I accepted that intellectually, my heart bristled with the quiet sting of exclusion. One afternoon, I entered the living room with a tray of snacks, anticipating a cheerful conversation as I often did. They were huddled together on the couch, whispering and laughing. I paused, hesitant, not wanting to intrude. My presence was ignored. They didn't look up, didn't pause, didn't invite me in. And in that moment, I felt the weight of invisibility settle over me like a heavy cloak. I set the tray down silently and retreated to my chair. I smiled at them anyway because smiling was expected. Smiling was safe. Smiling was the only way to navigate a home where my presence was optional. As I watched them, I realized something else. The more I withdrew, the more they didn't notice. My absence, subtle as it was, had become invisible as well. I had become a fixture, a constant presence whose voice and opinions were no longer central to the flow of their lives. I existed alongside them, but not within them. I remembered the early years after Saad's marriage, how I had anticipated this change, but not fully understood it. I had imagined that my role would shift slightly, that I would step back, yes, but that my presence would still be acknowledged. I had underestimated the speed and subtlety with which exclusion could take root. It wasn't just the major decisions or the weekend plans that bypassed me. It was the small, everyday interactions, the shared jokes, the whispered secrets, the simple touch on the arm that said, "We are together." They had a language of closeness I no longer spoke, and I was not included in the translation. One evening I attempted to bridge the gap. I offered a suggestion for a family outing, something small and thoughtful, hoping to participate in their world. Saad nodded politely, and Sanaa smiled, but the conversation quickly moved past me, seamlessly returning to the private dialogue they had cultivated. I smiled, tucked away my disappointment, and poured myself a cup of tea. I realized then that my attempts to participate were no longer necessary for their happiness. That night, I sat alone in my room, reflecting on the subtle shifts that had taken place. I realized that I was not angry. I did not feel betrayed. This was not about malice, it was simply life evolving, love transforming, and family dynamics adjusting. And yet, the ache of invisibility lingered. I felt the quiet grief of watching my world change without me. The next day, I found myself observing them more than interacting. I watched the way Saad laughed at Sanaa's jokes, the way she leaned slightly toward him, the shared glances that carried volumes of meaning. I loved them fiercely, but I also felt removed from the intimacy they now shared. I realized that this was their bond, and it was not diminished by my absence. It simply existed independently of me. In response, I began to withdraw further, not out of resentment, but as a means of self-preservation. I learned to observe quietly, to participate when necessary, but to accept that my role had shifted. I could no longer shape the rhythm of their household or influence their decisions in the way I once had. I had to find my place alongside them, not the center. Even simple family traditions began to highlight my distance. Baking cookies, which had once been a shared ritual, was now something Saad and Sanaa did together, laughing over spilled flour and imperfect shapes while I quietly washed the dishes. I smiled at the laughter, remembering the past, but inside I felt a pang of longing. The joy of participation had changed, it was theirs now, and I was a witness rather than a participant. I began to notice how easy it was for them to exclude me, not intentionally, but as a natural evolution of their closeness. Their private world required no malice, only intimacy. And I understood that intimacy sometimes demands absence, even from those who have loved and nurtured you for years. Yet, as I reflected on this, I also recognized the resilience within myself. I had always been the steady presence, the quiet anchor. And now, even as I felt invisible, I retained a subtle form of influence. My patience, my understanding, my quiet observation, these were my contributions. They were unseen, perhaps, but they were not meaningless. One afternoon, I found myself in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. I listened to their conversation in the living room, the sound of laughter and shared stories filtering through the walls. I smiled quietly, realizing that my invisibility did not erase my love or my care. It simply reshaped it. My role was no longer to direct or guide. It was to support, to observe, and to be present without expectation. That night, I reflected on the nature of belonging. I had once believed that to belong, one must be acknowledged, included, and central. Now, I understood that belonging could also mean existing quietly, loving without recognition, and finding fulfillment in subtle acts of care. I had not lost my place in the family. It had simply transformed. As I prepared for bed, I looked around the house, the photographs on the wall, the furniture arranged with care, the small touches that marked years of shared life. I realized that even in my invisibility, I was part of the fabric of this home. I had nurtured it, loved it, and shaped it in ways that could not be undone. My presence, though quieter now, still mattered. And in that realization, I felt a small but profound sense of peace. I was no longer at the center of their world, but I was still present, still loving, still part of the family I had built. Invisibility did not diminish my connection. It only demanded that I find new ways to express it, new ways to inhabit a space that had quietly shifted around me. I understood then that love could coexist with absence, presence with invisibility, and attachment with distance. And in that understanding, I began to accept the quiet evolution of our family life, finding strength and resilience in my own dignity, patience, and enduring love. The house had taken on a rhythm that no longer required me. I moved through it with care, soft footsteps, gentle hands, but increasingly, without expectation. I stopped raising my voice to share ideas, stopped interjecting with suggestions, and even stopped hoping for recognition. Silence had become my companion. At first, this retreat was uncomfortable. I remembered the years when my opinion had mattered, when a word from me could shape the household, when Saad had sought my guidance and smiled at my advice. Those days were gone. I could feel the gap growing with each unacknowledged comment, each private laugh between Saad and Sanaa, each small act that subtly excluded me. So I chose silence. I would sit quietly in the living room, hands folded, watching them interact. I smiled at the right moments, laughed when prompted, but said little. I found that words, when unheeded, were heavier than silence. Silence became easier, safer. And, in an unexpected way, it became comforting. I began to notice the beauty in simply observing. The tilt of Saad's head when he laughed, the way Sanaa's eyes sparkled in a private joke, the gentle gestures that spoke volumes between them. I could appreciate these moments without feeling hurt, without needing to insert myself. I realized that there was power in restraint and dignity in quiet. One evening, as I poured tea for the three of us, I watched Saad and Sanaa discuss an upcoming family event. I had no role in the planning, no influence over the decisions, yet I could see the joy and connection between them. I smiled and handed them their cups, feeling a quiet warmth in being part of the moment, even peripherally. It was in these small moments that I discovered something profound. My presence did not require recognition to matter. I did not need to dominate conversations, offer advice, or assert myself to be part of their lives. Simply being there, quietly and lovingly, was enough. The days continued in this pattern. Mornings filled with breakfast routines, afternoons with light chores and observation, evenings with tea and muted conversation. I had grown accustomed to my own company, finding solace in the rhythm of my daily tasks and the quiet awareness of my family's happiness. Yet, invisibility has a strange weight. It is both freeing and painful. I could watch without conflict, appreciate without expectation, yet the ache of being overlooked lingered beneath the surface. It was a quiet sorrow, one that shaped my movements, my expressions, my thoughts. I learned to carry it lightly, to let it exist without allowing it to dominate me. One afternoon, while folding laundry, I reflected on the subtle evolution of our family dynamics. Saad and Sanaa had created a shared world, a bond that was natural and beautiful, yet one that had no need for my constant input. I had once thought that love demanded centrality, that being a mother meant always being at the core of family life. Now, I understood that love could exist quietly, in support, in observation, in patience. As I carried the folded clothes to the bedroom, I overheard Saad and Sanaa planning a small weekend trip. I had no say in the itinerary, no input on timing or arrangements. And yet, I found myself feeling a quiet pride in their independence. They were building a life together, learning to navigate challenges as a team, forming a bond that was strong and resilient. My love for them was not diminished by my exclusion. In fact, it deepened, tempered by the understanding that true love does not demand acknowledgement. I poured myself a cup of tea and moved to the window, watching the late afternoon sunlight filter through the trees. The world outside was alive, filled with movement and sound, yet my house felt like a sanctuary, a place where I could exist fully in my own right. Silence, once uncomfortable, had become a source of strength. I reflected on the years of motherhood, the decades spent nurturing, guiding, and loving. Each moment of care, each sacrifice, each act of quiet support had not been in vain. They had shaped the people Saad and Sanaa had become, even if recognition was absent. And in that recognition, I found solace. My invisibility did not erase my impact. My love, though quiet, remained profound. Evenings became my time for reflection. I would sit in the living room after the household had settled, tea in hand, and consider the subtle victories of the day. A smile exchanged, a shared joke that included me, a small acknowledgement of presence. These moments, fleeting though they were, carried weight beyond their appearance. They were proof that silence could coexist with love, that patience could coexist with connection, and that invisibility could coexist with influence. I began to see my role differently. I was no longer the central figure in the household, nor did I need to be. I was the quiet observer, the steady presence, the invisible thread that connected past, present, and future. And in embracing this role, I discovered freedom. Freedom to love without expectation, freedom to exist without constant validation, freedom to define my presence on my own terms. There were still moments of ache, of longing for acknowledgement, of wishing that a glance or a word might confirm my place in their lives. But these moments became gentler, less consuming. I learned to carry them lightly, to recognize them without being overwhelmed. My invisibility had taught me resilience, patience, and the subtle power of quiet strength. As the night settled over the house, I poured myself another cup of tea and reflected on the evolution of our family life. The journey had not been easy, but it had been necessary. I had learned that love does not always require visibility, that influence can exist without acknowledgement, and that patience can coexist with quiet sorrow. And so I embraced my new reality. Silence was my companion, observation my tool, and love my guiding force. I had discovered that being invisible did not mean being unimportant. I had found a way to exist fully, quietly, and meaningfully, even as my family's shared world continued to evolve around me. Days had a rhythm now, a quiet rhythm where I existed without expectation, observed without acknowledgement, and loved without visible gratitude. I moved through the house carefully, adjusting pillows, straightening the table, pouring tea at the right moment, smiling when appropriate. My presence was assumed, yet unseen. It was subtle at first. A glance overlooked, a suggestion ignored, a conversation that passed me by. And then, gradually, it became a pattern. I was always there, yet no one seemed to notice the quiet effort, the invisible work that kept our family's life flowing smoothly. Even mundane tasks carried an emotional weight I hadn't anticipated. Setting the table, washing dishes, preparing meals. Each act was a reminder that my contributions no longer elicited acknowledgement. I was useful, yes, but I was no longer part of the decisions or the shared intimacy that Saad and Sanaa now enjoyed together. One afternoon, I was folding laundry while they discussed plans for an upcoming family gathering. Saad laughed at a joke Sanaa had made, his hand brushing hers briefly. I smiled quietly, folded a shirt, and retreated into silence. My advice about timing or arrangements would not be sought. My presence was incidental. I could choose to speak, but I knew it would not alter the flow of their private world. Once, Saad used to come into the kitchen rubbing sleep from his eyes, asking what I was making, telling me about his plans. Now, mornings belonged to him and Sanaa. Their schedules, their coffee preferences, their shared routines. I poured my tea into a cup I had owned for years, its handle chipped slightly from use. It struck me how long I had held onto things even as my role quietly slipped away. When Saad and Sanaa finally came into the kitchen, they greeted me kindly. There was warmth, politeness, familiarity, but no urgency. No curiosity about my morning, my thoughts, my plans. I smiled anyway, because smiling had become second nature. They talked about work, about errands, about things I wasn't part of. I listened, nodded, occasionally added a word or two when it felt appropriate. My voice sounded softer than I remembered, almost hesitant, as if unsure it belonged in the room. Sanaa thanked me for breakfast. Saad smiled and said it was good. That was all. And strangely, I felt grateful, because even small acknowledgments had begun to feel like gifts rather than expectations. Later that afternoon, Sanaa invited her friend over. I welcomed her politely, offered tea, and then retreated to my room. Not because I was asked to, but because I had learned when my presence was unnecessary. From my room, I could hear their laughter, their conversation flowing freely. I did not feel excluded in a dramatic way.
It was subtler than that.
It was the realization that my presence altered the dynamic, that conversations became careful when I was around. So I removed myself. And that hurt more than I expected. I sat on the edge of my bed and thought about the woman I used to be, the one who filled rooms, who made decisions, who was consulted, relied upon. That woman hadn't disappeared. She had simply stepped back, quietly, respectfully. But no one had noticed the cost of that step. In the evening, Saad came into my room briefly. "Mom, do you need anything?" he asked. His tone was gentle, loving, familiar. I shook my head.
"No, son.
"I'm fine." He nodded, smiled, and left. The door closed softly behind him, and I realized something painful and freeing at the same time. He had asked out of duty, not need. That distinction stayed with me. As days passed, I began to understand that invisibility was not imposed, it was negotiated. Slowly, through silence, through restraint, through choosing peace over confrontation. I wasn't pushed aside, I stepped aside. And yet, the emotional weight of that choice lingered. There were moments when I wanted to speak, to tell Saad that I missed him, that I missed being part of his inner world. But I held back. Not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to burden him with guilt. Love, I had learned, sometimes means carrying pain quietly so others can move freely. One evening, we sat together watching television. Saad and Sanaa on one couch, me on the other. The room was warm, calm, ordinary. To an outsider, we would have looked like a happy family. And we were. But happiness doesn't always mean closeness. At one point, Sana leaned her head on Saad's shoulder. He smiled without looking at her. It was instinctive, natural, beautiful. I looked away, not out of jealousy, but out of respect. Their bond did not need an audience. Still, a question rose inside me, uninvited and persistent. Where does a mother go when her child no longer needs her? I had no answer, only acceptance. That night, as I prepared for bed, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked older than I remembered, not because of wrinkles, but because of the quiet wisdom settling into my eyes. I wasn't invisible because I lacked value. I was invisible because my role had evolved. And evolution, I realized, often feels like loss before it feels like growth. I began to redefine myself, not as the center of the family, but as its quiet foundation. The one who didn't need to be seen to matter. The one whose love didn't demand attention. Some days were easier than others. Some days, the silence felt peaceful. Other days, it felt unbearably loud. But I stayed. I loved. I adapted. Because being invisible beside my family was still better than being absent from their lives. And slowly, gently, I began to understand that this phase, this quiet, unseen season, was not an ending. It was a transition. One that required patience, point one that required grace, point one that required letting go without resentment. As I turned off the light and lay down to sleep, I whispered a silent promise to myself. I will not disappear. I will simply learn how to exist differently. And in that promise, I found the strength to continue. It began with something small. So small that, at first, I almost missed it. One morning, Saad paused in the kitchen doorway instead of walking straight past me. I was standing at the counter, cutting fruit, lost in my thoughts. I hadn't heard him enter. "Mom," he said, softer than usual. I turned, a little surprised. "Yes, son?" He hesitated. Just for a second. Long enough for me to notice. "Did you sleep okay last night?" The question caught me off guard. Not because it was unusual, but because it had been absent for so long. "I did," I replied. "Thank you for asking." He nodded, smiled briefly, and left for work. That was all. No long conversation. No apology. No emotional confession. But something shifted inside me. Because he had noticed. And when you've grown used to being invisible, even a glance can feel like light. I didn't let myself read too much into it. Hope can be dangerous when it grows too fast. I continued my day as usual, quiet, observant, restrained. But my heart felt a little lighter, like it had been reminded of something it had almost forgotten. That evening, Saad came home earlier than usual. Sana was still at work. He sat at the dining table while I prepared dinner. "You don't have to cook today," he said casually. "We can order something." I smiled. "It's all right. I don't mind." He watched me for a moment. Really watched. The way my hands moved, the way I leaned slightly against the counter when I thought no one was looking. "You've been tired lately," he said. The words landed quietly, but firmly. "I'm fine," I replied instinctively. He didn't argue. He didn't push. But he didn't look convinced either. We ate dinner together that night. Just the two of us. It felt unfamiliar, like revisiting a place that once felt like home. He asked about my day. I answered honestly but briefly. Years of minimizing myself had trained me well. At one point, he put his fork down. "You don't talk much anymore," he said. I looked at him then. Really looked. His expression wasn't accusing. It wasn't offensive. It was confused. Concerned. "I talk when there's something to say," I replied gently. He frowned slightly. "There's always something to say." I smiled, not sadly, not bitterly. Just tired. "Sometimes," I said, "listening is easier." He didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, but this time, it felt different. Not dismissive. Thoughtful. That night, I lay awake again, but not with the familiar heaviness. My thoughts circled around his words, his expressions, the way he had looked at me as if seeing me for the first time in a long while. I wondered what had changed. The answer came slowly over the following days. Saad began lingering. In the kitchen, I in the living room, near me. He asked small questions. Offered help with small tasks. Nothing dramatic, just presence. Sana noticed too. She became quieter around me, more attentive. She asked if I liked certain meals, if I needed anything from the store. Her kindness felt genuine but tentative, as if she, too, was sensing something unspoken. One afternoon, I overheard them talking in their room. We ate dinner together that night. Just the two of us. It felt unfamiliar, like revisiting a place that once felt like home. He asked about my day. I answered honestly but briefly. Years of minimizing myself had trained me well. At one point, he put his fork down. You don't talk much anymore, he said. I looked at him then. Really looked. His expression wasn't accusing. It wasn't defensive. It was confused. Concerned. I talk when there's something to say, I replied gently. He frowned slightly. There's always something to say. I smiled, not sadly, not bitterly. Just tired. Sometimes, I said, listening is easier. He didn't respond immediately. The silence stretched, but this time, it felt different. Not dismissive. Thoughtful. That night, I lay awake again, but not with the familiar heaviness. My thoughts circled around his words, his expressions, the way he had looked at me as if seeing me for the first time in a long while. I wondered what had changed. The answer came slowly over the following days. Saad began lingering. In the kitchen, I in the living room, near me. He asked small questions. Offered help with small tasks. Nothing dramatic, just presence. Sana noticed too. She became quieter around me, more attentive. She asked if I liked certain meals, if I needed anything from the store. Her kindness felt genuine but tentative, as if she, too, was sensing something unspoken. One afternoon, I overheard them talking in their room. I think Mom feels lonely, Saad said. The words stopped me cold. Sana didn't respond right away. She doesn't say anything, she replied finally. I thought she was just adjusting. So did I, Saad said. But I think we stopped seeing her. I stepped away quietly, heart pounding. He hadn't said abandon. He hadn't said ignored. He had said stop seeing. And that felt dangerously close to the truth. That evening, Sana sat with me while I folded laundry. You've taken care of us so much, she said softly. We didn't mean to make you feel alone. I looked at her. This woman my son loved. This woman who had unknowingly become the center of a life I once held. I know, I said. And I meant it. Because blame had never been the point. Change had been. She hesitated. If there's ever something you want to say. I smiled gently. You'll know when I do. She nodded, relief and uncertainty mixing in her eyes. That night, as we sat together watching television, Saad sat beside me instead of across the room. Our shoulders touched briefly. He didn't move away. It was a small thing. But small things are how healing begins. I realized then that invisibility doesn't always end with confrontation. Sometimes it ends with awareness, with a quiet recognition that something precious has been overlooked. No one apologized, and no one cried, and no one made promises. But presence returned. And for the first time in a long while, I felt seen, not as a role, not as a responsibility, but as a person. A mother, a woman, a part of the family. The silence that had once isolated me now connected us. And I understood something important. Being invisible had taught me my worth. Being seen again reminded them of it. As I went to bed that night, I felt something unfamiliar but welcome. Not joy, not relief. Hope. Change did not arrive all at once. It came unevenly, awkwardly, like learning how to walk again after forgetting you ever knew how. After that evening, nothing in the house officially changed. No family meeting. No declarations. No emotional confessions that tied everything neatly together. But something shifted. Saad began noticing things. Noticing when I sat too long without moving. Noticing when I skipped meals. Noticing when my smile appeared too quickly, as if rehearsed. One afternoon, he stood in the doorway of my room, uncertain. Mom, he said, you used to go for walks in the evening. I looked up from my book. I did. Why did you stop?
I thought about it.
I suppose, I said slowly. I forgot why I started. He frowned. You liked them? I liked being needed afterward, I replied gently. The words surprised even me. They hung between us, soft but heavy. Saad didn't argue. He didn't dismiss it. He sat down instead. I didn't mean to, he started, then stopped. I didn't realize. I nodded. That's usually how it happens. Silence followed, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful, reflective. Later that week, Sana asked if I wanted to join her at the grocery store. The invitation was simple, casual, but it mattered. As we walked through the aisles, she asked my opinion on vegetables, on brands, on things that once would have been obvious. I could tell she was trying.
Carefully.
Respectfully. I hope you know, she said quietly, I never wanted you to feel outside. I met her eyes. I know. And I never wanted to feel in the way. She exhaled slowly. I think we were both being careful. That felt true. Careful not to offend. Careful not to intrude. Careful not to claim space. And in that carefulness, distance had grown. That evening, Saad cooked dinner. It wasn't very good. But no one said anything. We laughed, really laughed, for the first time in a long while. I realized then how much I had missed shared imperfection. Shared effort. Shared presence. Later, as we cleaned up together, Saad said, You don't have to disappear for us to be a family. I paused, hands wet with soap. I didn't disappear, I said softly. I just stopped insisting on being seen. He looked at me then, not as a son looking at his mother, but as a man recognizing a woman's quiet endurance. I should have noticed, he said. I shook my head. You were living your life. That's what parents hope for. But not at the cost of you, he replied. That sentence stayed with me, because for a long time I had believed that was the cost. Over the next few days, small changes layered over one another. They waited for me before starting meals. They asked before making plans. They included without performing inclusion. And I slowly, cautiously, began speaking again. Not with demands, not with advice, but with honesty. One evening, as we sat together, Sana asked, What do you want now, Mom? The question startled me. Wanting had felt dangerous for so long. I want to belong, I said. Without being central. Without being invisible. She nodded. Saad reached for my hand.
We can do that, he said.
I believed him. Not because of his words, but because of his attention. For the first time in years, I felt neither necessary nor irrelevant. I felt chosen. And that was enough. There was a strange calm that settled over the house. Not the quiet of distance, but the quiet of understanding. It showed itself in the smallest ways. Saad would glance at me before leaving the room, as if checking whether I needed anything. Sana would sit beside me instead of across the room. Conversations slowed down, widened, made space for my voice without demanding it. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel like I was borrowing space in my own home. One evening, Saad came home visibly tired. He dropped his keys on the counter and leaned back against the wall, eyes closed. Long day? I asked. He nodded. Hard decisions. Too many expectations. I poured him tea and handed it to him, something I had done thousands of times before. But this time, he didn't take it absent-mindedly. Thank you, Mom, he said, looking at me fully. I don't say that enough. I smiled. You don't have to say it every time. But I stopped meaning it out loud, he replied. That honesty mattered. Later that night, he sat with me after Sana went to bed. I didn't realize how much you were holding back, he said quietly. You made it look easy. I didn't want to be a burden, I replied. You were never a burden, he said quickly. Then, more slowly, you were a foundation. And I treated you like furniture. Always there. Never noticed. He winced after saying it. I reached out and touched his arm. We learn as we grow. I had to learn, too, how to let go without disappearing. He nodded, eyes shining. That was when I understood something important. Being seen does not mean being needed again, that it means being acknowledged. And that acknowledgement healed something deep inside me. In the days that followed, I reclaimed parts of myself quietly. I went on evening walks again. I read books in the living room instead of my bedroom. I spoke when I had something to say and stayed silent when I didn't. No guilt and no withdrawal, just balance. Sana noticed too. You seem lighter, she said one morning. I feel allowed, I replied.
She smiled at that.
The moment I knew everything had truly changed came unexpectedly. Saad and Sana were planning a move, nothing drastic, just a few blocks away. A new apartment. A new chapter. Old fear stirred inside me, but it didn't take over. Saad came to me before finalizing anything. Mom, he said, sitting beside me, we want you to come with us. But not because you have to. I waited. We want you because you choose to be with us, he continued. And because we choose you too. I felt tears rise, not from fear, but from relief. I will come, I said, as long as I still have my own space. My own life. Sana nodded. That's exactly what we want. In that moment, I realized something profound. I was no longer invisible, and I was no longer central. I was equal. The move was simple. The new home felt lighter, brighter. There were boundaries now, healthy ones, respectful ones. I wasn't expected to manage their lives, and I wasn't excluded from them either. One evening, as we sat together eating dinner, Saad laughed and said, I don't know how we lived without you. I smiled. You did. And you will. That's the point. He laughed, but he understood. Later that night, alone in my room, I looked at my reflection again. This time, I didn't see invisibility. I saw strength, that I saw dignity, that I saw a woman who had loved deeply and learned to love herself too. I had not lost my son, that I had not been replaced, I had simply stepped into a new season. And in that season, I was no longer shrinking to fit into someone else's life. I was living my own. I sat at the same table, in the same house, with the people I loved most. Yet somehow, I felt invisible. My son laughed with his wife. They made plans, shared dreams, built a life, and I quietly learned how to listen without interrupting. No one pushed me away, and no one was cruel. They just stopped noticing. So I smiled, I stepped back, I loved them without asking to be seen. Until one day, my son looked at me and said, Mom, when did you stop talking? And in that moment, everything we never said finally spoke.